Hey everyone, I'm Jay and welcome to my video on using the grid. You can see my example here. I built what's called a Holy Grail layout, which is when you have a header across the top, a footer across the bottom, and then you have the 3-column layout in the middle with two asides and then a main, right? And strictly speaking, none of these have to be a particular element. They don't have to be named anything special. That naming convention is all yours to do with whatever you like. I've used some common names for mine, but they are by no means a written standard anywhere. You can name them whatever you like. So let's dive in here and have a look at what we've got, and then I'll kind of walk through all the parts in here that actually make the grid what it is, and I'll try to talk about what the grid is to begin with. We'll do that first. So the grid, it's CSS powered, all right, and it's really awesome. I'm having trouble telling you how awesome it is. Previous ways that we would lay things out with floats or different positioning tricks, and they were great, but they each, or tables even, right? All the things that we used to do had some fairly serious limitations, which spawned the development of both the Flexbox and the grid. I think the grid is amazing, right? There are certain things that the Flexbox can do that the grid can't do, and then I like the things that the grid can do that the Flexbox kind of can't do as well. So very briefly, the Flexbox is a little bit better for kind of automatically putting a bunch of boxes in order, and you may not know how many boxes you have. That's the real beauty of the Flexbox, is its flexibility. The grid, however, is you defining a two-dimensional layout grid, and then saying, okay, which elements go in which box. So basically, you just tell the browser to draw some boxes, you pick the size, and there are some cool values that you can use to kind of automatically pick different sizes. So I haven't put in any hard values in here at all. These are all flexible sizes that I've used, and you can see it does a very good job. And let me just highlight, excuse me, over here. We can see I've highlighted in my inspector view, which is kind of off camera because I don't want to crowd the camera with so much stuff to the screen. Hopefully you can see these purple dashed lines. Those are the lines that I've defined with the grid. And so I've defined 3 columns across and then 4 rows down. Grids can automatically extrapolate further rows down if you have more stuff. Your mileage may vary with how accurate the grid can kind of figure that out for you. So I try to be well defined in what I'm going to be building with my grid. And so seeing that I have 3 columns across, when I go to put the header in, and there are a couple ways you can define it. I like to use names. So I named my header. Surprise, I've named it header. And then I've said, okay, I'm going to put the header in the first box, the second box, and the third box. It's going to stretch all the way across all 3 of them. And you'll see the code in a minute of what that looks like. The same thing for the nav and the same thing for the footer, because they span multiple boxes. I've just said it's going to be in all 3 of those boxes. And the grid, the browser knows, okay, you're going to be in all 3 of those boxes. You're going to span across all 3 of them. And then for the left, the middle, and the right columns there in the content area, that's just one element filling in one box. Okay. There are some creative things you can do once you get a hang of this, and you can put things in weird boxes. You can kind of have them overlap, maybe in a corner of something. You can do some creative things. One of the things that I've done, as soon as we look at this HTML code, you'll see that once you define the grid and you tell each element where it's supposed to be, the order they appear in the HTML no longer matters. And so I have first the header, then the nav, then both the asides, then the main, and then the footer. But obviously you can see that the asides do straddle either side of the main. It doesn't matter the order. Once you define the grid and you say where everything is, the order that you put it in the HTML no longer becomes important because you very well defined where it goes. So let's have a look at the HTML first. I have a header with just an H1 in there saying what it is that we're doing today. I have a nav with just one link to my YouTube. If you're watching this, you already know where it is. Then I have two asides, and I named them with classes. They each just have three through the same image over again. I named aside left and aside right. The reason I name with classes instead of IDs is I'm pretty weary of naming things with generic IDs because I used a lot of other tools in development, and I don't want to have anything use the same name as me for an ID. So I use a class instead and fight it that way. Even though it's just a small example, I still do that. Then I have the main, just has an H2, a couple of warm-ups and paragraphs. Lastly, a footer with just a copyright in there. Okay, so nothing too special in here, just some, fairly average dummy content. Let's have a look at the CSS. Let's go up to the top here. Just some boilerplate stuff. I got my box sizing border box. Body has a background color. And the page element, which we didn't look at, this is just wrapped around everything. This is my wrapper. I've called it page. So the page element, any of the elements that have grid stuff, I've written the grid CSS first, and we can ignore the rest. The rest is basically just color and padding. And for the page element, I do have a max width and a width. But the page element, to enable grid in the first place, you say the display is going to be grid. Before we had grid, the display would have probably been inline or block or possibly display none. Okay, now we're going to do display grid. And now I'm going to define the grid. First, I'm going to define the columns. And you do this, I have this cool unit called FR. This is a fractional unit. So I have one column that's one fractional unit. The next column is two fractional units. And then the third column is one fractional unit. And what this is a very flexible unit. It says, okay, I have my three columns. It's going to divide the space evenly into fractional units. The browser does all the math. You don't have to do any math. And the middle one, because it's two and the other ones are one, it's going to be twice as big as either of the two sides. So I can put whatever numbers are in here. I can put whatever numbers I want, and the browser will figure it out for me. So if I wanted the middle one to be 7 times as big as the one on the left and 2 times as big as the one on the right, I'll just put whatever numbers I have to for that. I'll put 7 in the middle, 1 on the left, and 3.5 on the right, and it'll figure it out. It'll take all the available space, divide it however it needs to be divided, and show me that. So fractional units are very cool, and I like to use those for columns when appropriate, of course. You could use pixels, you could use percentage. I could do the same thing with percentage. This is going to equal to 25% on either side and 50% in the middle. Okay, that would be the same thing right there. But I could use 200 pixels on either side and then put one fractional unit in the middle, and it will just take whatever is left to put it in the middle. But also in the next one, I have this keyword auto 3 times. So while I'm defining the rows, the first row, that's where the header is, the height is auto, the auto value means it's going to take that value from the content area, or the content of that element. Same thing for the nav, which is the second row. It's going to take that height from the content. And then 1FR for the middle. And the reason I've done this is normally I would have my page thing have a min height, which I'm going to type in here, and it's going to be, let's do 90 VH is my min height, and I'll save that. So 90 VH for my min height, which means 90% of the viewport height, the available viewport height, will be the minimum height for my page element. I like to do just a little bit less oftentimes, or exactly the viewport height. I do have a bit of padding here to try and prevent unnecessary scrolling. But you'll see with my rows here, I have 3 that are set to auto for the header, the nav, and the footer. And then the remaining height is going to be that 1 fractional unit left over. And this next row is going to fill in all the remaining height. And then this really cool multi-line of code that you see here that you've probably just been staring at, probably figured it out already. This is where I'm going to define which elements go in which spot. So across the first row in all 3 columns is going to be the header. Across the second row in all 3 columns is going to be the nav. Across the third row, it's going to be first is going to be the left, then the main, then the right, and across the last row, it's going to be footer, footer, footer all the way across. Grid gap is an option where I can set an optional gap between all the pieces in the grid. I do believe the default is 0, but I do like to define it sometimes just in case it got overridden somewhere. So there's no gap. All the elements will marry right up to each other. Whatever names you use here, you do have to define that. And I'll scroll down and show you where that gets defined in each of the elements. Just because I have a header element doesn't necessarily mean I've named it header element. I could name it something else. I like to name it something easy, so I chose header. Let's scroll down and have a look. So nav is first. On my CSS it is anyway. And this is how you name it. You just name the CSS property grid area, and then you get to name it whatever you want. I haven't run into really any keywords that don't work, although left and right do get colored differently in CodePen, and I have seen some things that get colored differently by the IDE here, but I have not used any kind of keyword names that stop me from working. So there probably are some keywords you shouldn't use, but I haven't found them myself. Right. So that's the grid area name for nav. I haven't set any other grid relative things for nav. I've just set like some margins and colors and list style, some typical list navigation things. Then the header, I've named it the grid area header. Okay, I've not set any other grid stuff, so I just gave it margin, padding, and color. The main area, I named it main with the grid area property. And then the only other thing I gave it is padding, width, and height. Oh, I did give it a width. I should take that out. And I give it a min height. I don't need that either. Right, just the padding. Take both of those out because it's in a grid. I don't need that height. And then the aside itself, I gave all of them 5 pixels of padding. That's nothing special there. But then I named the left and right respectively. And I set some image stuff here, named the footer, and some footer margin, padding, and color here. And that's it, right? That's everything. The bulk of it all goes in the page, which is that's the grid itself. Everything else, I just gave it a name, and that's it. There are some other ways to define grids. You can define the lines that separate everything, and then you can put things in their place that way. And I could put the code right here in the individual pieces where they belong. I don't like to do that. It kind of adds a level of complexity that I don't need. I'm quite comfortable with just setting up the rows and columns, naming everything, and then putting the name right here. That's very comfortable for me. It probably is for a lot of you as well. But you do have the option of doing it some other ways, but I'm not going to talk about them in this video. So that's it for looking in this grid. All right. Feel free to go back and pause the video at any code that you really want to see. I'm just kind of going to scroll through slowly towards the end of the video in case you do want to see something. But that's it. Hope you learned something, and I'll see you next time.